Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the Speed Chess Championship being held on chess.com. Now as you guys know, I had a resounding victory yesterday in the quarterfinals against Fabiano Caruana, but today the five-time former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen was back in action playing against Jan Nepomniachtchi, a rematch of the 2021 World Chess Championship. So let's jump right into the action. So first game we're going to be taking a look at is game number 6 of the match. Now in game number 1, Magnus tried to follow the classic meme of bro thinks he's Hikaru by losing to Jan Nepomniachtchi. Now they drew games 2 and 3, and then Magnus won 2 games in a row to take a 3-2 lead heading into this fateful game 6. So Magnus on a bit of a run in the 5+1 portion, and Jan trying to stop the bleeding. So the game starts with e4 from Jan, and here Magnus decides to play e5, and now we get the move f4, which of course is the classic king's gambit. Now here Magnus decides to play e takes f4, accepting the gambit, and now Jan plays the move knight f3. We get the move g5, and here we have h4, g4, and knight to e5. Now this is a very old variation. This is known as the Kieseritzky variation within the king's gambit, except it's been around for a long time. I think it's been around for somewhere around 150 years. So here Magnus plays d6, we get knight takes g4, knight to f6, and now Jan decides to play this move knight f2. Now those of you guys who have watched my channel in the past, you probably will recognize this position as it is identical to the Armageddon position, which was featured in the game between Hikaru Nakamura, the streamer, and Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion. Now in that game, Hikaru decided to play knight takes f6, and after queen takes f6, we have the moves d3, knight to c6, queen to f3, attacking the pawn on f4. Magnus played bishop h6, and after queen f2, trying to sidestep the knight d4 fork, Magnus replied with rook g8, knight c3, bishop e6, bishop d2, castles, and queen to d4. And at this point in the game, Hikaru was already quite a bit worse. Magnus would go on to win the game when Hikaru decided to not trade the queen, simply due to the fact that it was an Armageddon game where Hikaru had to win. So Magnus has actually played this quite a bit in recent times, but Jan, unlike Hikaru, is considered to be probably the biggest proponent of the king's gambit, so you expect him to have some great ideas prepared. So we get knight to f2, retreating the knight and guarding the pawn on e4. Magnus plays knight c6, we get d4, and now the move bishop h6 is played. Now here Jan has built a nice white center with the pawns on e4 and d4, but the problem is, how do you develop the rest of your pieces? All the while black can play rook g8 and take advantage of having this open g file in spite of the double f pawns. So here we get c3 played by Jan, trying to protect the pawn on d4 and continue building this big center. We get rook to g8, which prevents white from moving the light square bishop without hanging this pawn on g2. Now we get the move knight to d2, trying to develop the knight to f3 and support maybe a thrust with pawn to e5. Magnus plays queen to e7, pinning the pawn on e4. And now Jan plays this move queen to b3. Now it's a very unpleasant situation here, because when you're playing a blitz game, you're trying to get out of the opening and play moves fairly quickly, but it's already very dangerous. In fact, computer thinks that white is already close to loss. Now the problem for Jan here is, how do you finish your development? If you move the light square bishop to say d3, you simply hang the pawn on g2. So you can't really move the bishop and castle the king, but then you also can't move this knight. You'd love to go something like knight f3, bishop d2, let's just say queen c2, castle the king out of the center of the board, and white has finished his development while keeping the center intact. But if you play knight f3, now you simply hang the pawn on e4. So what are you supposed to do? You can't move the bishop, can't move the knight, and otherwise, how are you finishing your development? So Jan plays this move queen to b3 here with the idea of preventing Magnus from finishing his development. The idea is simple. Black would love to move the bishop and simply, let's just say, castle the king out of the center of the board, and then black can play something like rook e8 here, and there's massive pressure in the center of the board as well as on the open g file. So queen b3 played by Jan, and this is actually a massive blunder, and here Magnus strikes immediately with this resounding rook to g3 move. Now at first glance, this move might look a little bit weird, because what does it actually threaten? But in fact, there are two very dire threats. The first one is, let's just say white plays a move like rook h2. You hang the juicer on d4 because of the pin, pawn takes knight, rook takes queen, you lose the queen and you lose the game. Additionally, let's just say white were to play a move like queen c2, for example, there's this move rook to e3, checking the king here, and after a move like bishop e2, black's another really nasty move with bishop to f5, overloading this pawn on e4 and taking advantage of this in-between double stack. If white captures the bishop, then you lose your bishop on e2, and after king to f1, it's rook e1 checkmate. Uh-oh, how embarrassing. Additionally, you can't really castle because you still hang the bishop on e2, and if you play a move like king f1, I can simply, I believe, sack the rook, and after king e2 I have this move d5 here, and suddenly white has all kinds of problems in the center of the board. Let's just say you move the queen to b3, and now after castles, e5 and knight to h5, there's knight g3 forking the king and the rook. You have rook g8 incoming here, and this simply looks like a bomb cloud gone wrong. But for a player like Jaron Nepomniachtchi, who does not play any of these meme openings, in fact he frowns upon anything that is supposed to be entertaining whatsoever, you do not expect to see him in such a position. So here Jaron plays the move knight to f3, basically trying to break the pin and figuring, well, I'm sacking the pawn on e4, but after I sack the pawn I can move my king. And now their idea is, like, let's just say black plays a move like king, let's just say bishop g7, white can suddenly play a move like bishop to b5 with the idea of rook to e1, bringing the rook to the center of the board, or even a move like bishop to d2 with the idea of bringing the other rook to e1, and suddenly white finishes his development very, very quickly. So Jaron is feeling very good about himself, but actually the position is already completely lost. Now here Magnus plays the move bishop e6, which is a very good move, but the computer here I believe suggests something even nastier, which I believe is bishop to g4, trying to take advantage of this weak knight on f3. If you go bishop e2, guarding the knight, rook takes g2, sacking the rook, and after king g2, queen e2, king g1, and bishop f3, you simply cannot stop checkmate on g2 or e1. If you go bishop d2, checkmate, queen g2. If you play rook h2, there's queen e1 checkmate, and the king simply has no squares. Magnus, however, plays bishop e6, which is also a very, very good move here, because he realizes that if Jaron takes his pawn on b7, you can play rook to b8, and after queen takes c7 is played here, now you can sack the rook with rook takes b2, checking the king. If white captures the rook, queen e3 is simply checkmate, king is stuck. And if you play a move like king to g1, for example, now there's rook b takes g2, sacking the rook again, and after bishop takes g2, you have queen takes f3, bishop is pinned here. If queen c6, I just take, and you can't recapture due to the pin. And if you play a move, you actually have no checks here. Queen c8 hangs the queen, queen b8, same thing, so you have no checks on b8 or c8, knight isn't hanging. And if you play rook to h2, guarding the bishop, now I have bishop to h3, overloading the bishop on g2, and now white basically has to sack the queen in order to avoid checkmate in the next couple of turns. So Jaron decides to play bishop c4 instead. Magnus trades the bishops, and now he decides to castle. Now here Magnus could have won the game on the spot with this move knight to e5, and it's a very, very beautiful move because white cannot capture the knight without losing the queen. If white captures with the knight, then there's queen g2, queen takes h1, and the whole house is collapsing. And if white plays move queen to e2, you can sack the rook with rook takes g2, king g2, queen takes e2, and black wins the game. Instead, Magnus castles. A little bit sad to see him castle, but he decides to castle instead. Jaron plays bishop to d2, and now Magnus strikes with knight to e5. And here, Jaron Nepomniachtchi resigns after 17 moves. Now, the reason Jaron resigns is, as I illustrated, you can't take due to the queen hanging, can't go to e2. And if you play a move like queen f1, I can simply go knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and after queen takes pawn, king e1, I have rook to e8 check. I guess you can block with the bishop, but after rook takes bishop, king d2, rook g2, king c1, I think you sack the rook here. King b1 gets mated in a couple of moves, and if you take the rook, I simply take, and either square you move to with the king, you get checkmated immediately. So after knight to e5, Magnus wins this huge game, and he takes a massive 4-2 lead in the match. Now this game I think highlights why the King's Gambit is unfortunately not really playable at the top levels of chess, despite the fact that so many of us want to try and pretend that we're romantics at heart and play the classic romantic style of chess, like the famous former unofficial first world chess champion Paul Morphy from America. But alas, in this modern day and age, it's very difficult to play because there are too many lines where black is a little bit better out of the opening. And in this game, you see Jaron Nepomniachtchi, probably the foremost expert of this opening, get demolished by Magnus, and that is not a good sign for this opening. And I don't think either Jaron Nepomniachtchi or Hikaru Nakamura will be trying this opening anytime soon against Magnus Carlsen. So huge win for Magnus, takes a 4-2 lead in the 5+1 portion, and we're going to fast forward to the next game. So next game we're going to be taking a look is game number 13 of the match. Magnus still has a 2-point lead. It's 7-5, but Jaron is hanging around. So this is in the second portion of 3+1. Magnus starts out with the move e4, and now we get the move c5 from Jaron. Knight f3, e6, and now Magnus decides to play c3, the classic c3 Sicilian, or the Alpine Sicilian, where white plays e4 with c3. Usually the main way you get it is here with c3 on move 2, but I think in this game Magnus felt much more comfortable with e6 being played, and here we get the move d5. Magnus trades the pawns on d5, plays d4, knight f6, bishop to e2. We get knight to c6, and now Magnus decides to castle. We get bishop e7, and here we have this very original move, pawn to c4. Now I'm going to be honest, I have seen c4 in this position before, but it is not considered the main line. Most people here will either take the pawn and try to gain some tempo on the queen on c5, or go for the standard knight to a3, trying to go for the classic family fork. Let's say h6, knight b5, a6, and knight c7 would be forking the king, the queen, and the rook at the same time. Magnus, however, decides to play c4. We get queen d7, and now he decides to trade the pawns on c5 and play a3. Now Magnus's idea here actually quite straightforward and pretty intuitive and logical if you think about it. Magnus wants to play a3 and b4 to attack the bishop and take some space with these pawns on the queen side. Additionally, if you get a position like this, for example, you'll notice that white has a 3 on 2, and then you have bishop b2. Great scope for the bishop on b2, and you can develop the knight to either c3 or d2. So Jaron decides to castle, and Magnus plays b4. It's also very important to note that at the start of this back here, you have to figure out how do you develop this knight. Do you go to d2 or a3? But Magnus finds the other route via c3 potentially as well. So we get to this position, castles is played, we get b4, and now Jaron plays bishop d4, which is a fairly serious mistake here because Magnus is able to lift the rook with rook to a2 and the idea of playing rook to d2, and out of nowhere black is suddenly in a lot of trouble because he's going to struggle to finish his development on the queen side with the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8. So here we get e5 being played by Jaron. Magnus plays b5, removing the knight from the c6 square. We get knight to e7, and now this move rook to d2 is played, and already it's very clear why Magnus removed the knight. He simply wants to capture the bishop and win a pawn here, and the knight will not be protecting the bishop on d4 any longer. So we get knight to f5. Now Magnus plays knight takes e5, a brutal move here, snatching a pawn in the center of the board. Black could take the knight, but after rook takes queen here, white will have a queen and a pawn in return for a rook and a bishop, and objectively it should be winning for white. So we get queen c7. Magnus plays rook takes bishop on d4 here. Jaron decides to take the knight. If he were to capture the rook after queen takes knight, rook d8, and let's just say queen b2, white will have a bishop and a knight in return for the rook, and white should be completely winning. So we get queen takes e5. Magnus plays rook to d3 here. Computer likes rook d2 very slightly more since the bishop would be guarding the pawn, but both moves are fine. So we get bishop to e6. Magnus plays knight d2. We get the move rook to d8. Magnus plays knight to f3, bringing his knight to the center of the board immediately, and there's only one piece left to be developed, which is this bishop on c1. So we get queen to c7 played here by Nepo, and now Magnus plays queen c2, and here Jaron goes knight d6. Now on first glance you're like, wait a second, queen takes pawn, free pawn, but after the queen trade, white can take the rook on d8, and if you recapture after bishop takes c4, rook c8, and bishop a2, white simply has one extra bishop on the board. And after rook d8, if you play bishop takes bishop, I swap the rooks, go rook to e1, and white has a rook in return for a knight in the endgame, and it should be a pretty simple position to win. Additionally, if you play bishop takes c4, there's either rook takes d8 or even rook c3 with the double stack on the c file, and once again white should be winning the game very soon. So we get knight e6 from Nepo. Magnus plays c5 here, attacking the knight, and now this move bishop f5 is played. Now if you were to take the pawn, white wins due to the fossil with rook takes rook, and you discover this knight on b5, and white has an extra bishop, and it's GG, why not? So Nepo plays bishop f5, thinking that he's actually pinned the rook and maybe he's going to win some material. White cannot capture the knight because then you hang the queen and lose the game. So Magnus plays bishop to f4, pinning the knight on d6. Nepo plays queen c8, and now Magnus plays rook c1. Another excellent move here where Magnus doesn't care. He's sacking the rook on d3, but he realizes he has the bishop pair as well as a passed c-pawn that he can push up the board. So rook c1 is an excellent move because while sacking this rook on d3, you'll notice that after knight to e8, now there's this move c6, and the rook and the queen are stacked behind this passed pawn, which white is pushing really quickly up the board. Black's rook on f8, not in the game. Knight on e8, not in the game. And these two bishops are simply monsters here. They hit all the critical diagonals. Great scope. So Nepo trades the pawn, trades on c6. Magnus now plays knight e5, another very nasty move. Bishop to f5 also probably would have been good enough after queen 8 and b takes c6 with this idea of c7, but knight e5 is also an excellent move as well. So we get knight e5, Nepo plays knight to d5, and now Magnus takes a pawn on c6 here. Magnus could have captured on h7 as well, but I think he figured after knight takes pawn, rook is under attack, pawn on h7 is under attack, and black can't capture the bishop because then you fork the king and the queen with knight to e7. So we get knight ef6 played here. Magnus now decides to take the rook. We get a queen trade here, and dust is starting to settle. On first glance, after knight takes f4, you're like, wait a second, bishop is under attack, knight is under attack, wait, two pieces under attack, you can't guard them both. But Magnus has a very creative move here, which is this move rook to d2, which indirectly guards both pieces. First, the rook is guarding the bishop from being captured for free. Secondly, if black takes a knight, you can now go for the fossil with bishop takes h7, checking the king. And after king takes bishop, rook takes rook. Black does have two horses in return for a tower, but the tower is going to go gobble the pawns on the queen side. And with these two pawns over here, white will get a new queen and win the game very soon. So Nepo plays rook to e8. Magnus goes king f1 here, stopping the ice skater with rook to e1 check. We get knight 6 to d5. Knight c6 is played here. Knight c3, and now Magnus goes bishop c4, and already here the game is effectively over because Magnus is up a pawn in the endgame. He has a 2-on-1 on the queen side. Pawn on a7, very weak here. White also can create the kebab with rook to d7, and in general these knights are just not coordinated very well. So Nepo goes g6, Magnus plays g3, kicking the horse away from f4, and this is one of the reasons if you can't get those bastions in chess, the horses are not always as good as you think they are. So we get knight to e6, and now Magnus plays rook d7, creating the kebab, attacking both the pawns on f7 and a7. And here Nepo plays knight e4. Magnus goes king g2, not rook takes pawn here because you don't want to be too hasty, because then knight to d2 check would fork the king and the bishop. And after king g2, knight takes c4. Black is very much back in the game. So we get king g2 here because Magnus realizes no forks for the horses. You can just wait and capture the pawn on the next turn or two, and it's just totally hopeless. So here Nepo goes knight 4 to c5. Magnus plays rook takes pawn. We get knight to g5, h4, a nice move, kicking the knight back. If you go knight to e4, I simply take the pawn and win the rook here. And after knight e6, b6, Nepo has to resign this game because the knight is very well placed on c6. You have the idea of b7 and b8. b7, of course, protected by the rook, and the knight covers the other queening square. And black will have to give up at least one of the knights for the b pawn, and white will be up a piece. And against Magnus Carlsen, you simply have no hope. So very, very big win here for Magnus Carlsen. He takes an 8-5 lead in the 3+1 portion. I believe that going into the final portion, he would win a couple more games along the way, and going into the bullet portion, he was leading by a score of 11.5 to 6.5. So he opened up the gap starting with this game, moving it from a 2-game advantage all the way up to a 5-game advantage going into the bullet portion. So the third and final game we're going to be taking a look at is game number 19 of the match. Now this is played in the bullet portion, 1 minute plus 1 second increment. Now Magnus is leading by a score of 12.5 to 6.5, 6-point lead. Very, very good stuff, but we're going to see if he can start to pull away completely. So we get e4 being played here by Nepo. Magnus goes e5, knight to c3, knight to c6, and now we have bishop c4. Knight f6, d3, and knight a5 is played here. Now this opening is the Vienna. Many of you probably seen my opening videos where I play this opening with white many times. Normally here I'll play moves like queen to f3 or knight ge2 potentially, giving black the opportunity to double the c pawns, but it's very easy to play because you can play knight ge2, bishop g5, and castle the king to either the queen side or the king side. Alas, bishop b3 is played by Nepo, and this is a mistake. Now, I don't remember when exactly I had this position last, but I remember playing this, I think, in some blitz games against Nicholas Theodorou, who goes by the username of Kriari Online, very strong Greek grandmaster, and he actually played the line that Magnus plays in this game, which is knight takes bishop, white takes with the a pawn, and now this move d5. Of course, Magnus trying to strike out and build the big black center. Here we get pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now Nepo goes queen h5 in this position. Now already here it's a very difficult position to play for white because black has the two bishops, a little bit more control in the center with the pawn on e5 versus d3. So all these trumps combined with the fact that Nepo is down in the match means he decides to go all in with queen h5. Now after queen to h5 is played here, Magnus plays knight b4. He does not worry about protecting his pawn on e5 because when you go knight b4, suddenly these pawns on c2 and d3 are very, very brittle here. They're really weak and hard to defend. So Nepo grabs a pawn, we get bishop to e7 played, and now Nepo plays the move queen to e2. If Nepo were to capture the pawn on g7, hoping for knight c2 and king d2, knight a1, queen h8, Magnus would say no. He would actually invert the order, and before taking the pawn here, he would play bishop f6, attacking the queen and guarding the rook. And when you move the queen away, then knight takes c2, forks the king and the rook, and after king f1, knight takes a1, black simply has an extra rook on the board. So we get queen to e2 played by Nepo, guarding the pawn. Magnus castles, we get bishop to e3. Now we have this move rook to e8, knight to f3, b6, and castles. Now on first glance you'll think, wait a second, let's do the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. White has an extra pawn here, but the problem is white has a lot of issues. First of all, these pawns are always being spied on c2 and d3 by the knight, but black also has this great bishop on this long light square diagonal here, and even bishop c5 or bishop f6 are playable, and it's very hard for white to guard against all these different threats, and in bullet especially, it is probably too much to ask for. So Nepo plays rook to c1, and now Magnus goes bishop f8. Maybe not the absolute best move, but it's still a great move with the idea of maybe f5, f4, going after the bishop on e3 with the pin, or queen to f6, or maybe even the rook lift with rook to e6 and g6. So Nepo goes rook e1, and now we get queen to d7, h3 played here, and now this nasty move rook e6 is played by Magnus, with the idea of doing the classic rook lift here to g6 and really going after this knight on f3 and this pawn on g2. Now, anybody who's played any of the FPS games or shooter games should know that, like, ops are great. Ops, like using the sniper from long distance, whether it be COD, Fortnite, Apex, you want to use your sniper. And in this position, this sniper is so good on b7 because white simply can't do anything about this bishop. It's always spying the knight and the pawn, and you're always under a lot of pressure. So Nepo plays knight d2, which is a blunder here, but already here it's very hard to play, because after knight g5 and rook g6, you can see these massive threats that are looming here on the king side here with the bishop, the rook, and the queen. Now computer thinks that after queen h5, h6, knight e4, white is maybe okay in this position, but you always have to be worried about f5 ideas down the road, and it's just very hard to play. Now when you compound that with the fact that this is a bullet game, I think it's really too much to ask. So we get knight d2, Magnus plays rook g6, we get f3, and now Magnus plays queen takes h3, taking this pawn near the king. And already here white is in loads of trouble. Black has evened out the material. You've got the bishop pair, you can bring the last rook into the game. White's pieces are very passive here, and everything is in perfect harmony for Magnus. So we get queen to f2, rook to e8 is played here by Magnus. We get knight ce4, trying to maybe break the pin, but now Magnus plays queen to d7 back. Just a simple quiet move, avoiding any weird tricks like knight g5 or knight f6, very calmly saying, you know what, material's even, but I still have a bunch of threats towards your king on g1. We get d4 being played here by Nepo. Magnus goes f5, we get knight to g5, and now we have this nasty move knight to d5, and white has to deal with the fact that how do you guard this knight on g5 at this point. If you play a move like knight f1, I'll simply trade down, take the knight, and I have an extra bishop on the board. And so Nepo decides instead to play knight h3. Now Nepo could have played the move f4 here, but this is still very bad after h6, knight to f3 and bishop d6, because white really has to deal with this weak pawn on f4. And if you go knight e5, I simply trade it all down, and spaghetti-o. At the end of the day, the sniper does its job, and white has been eliminated from the game. So in this position, it's simply lost anyway. If you can't go knight e5, you're going to lose the pawn, and these bishops combined with a great knight placement, the rook on g6, it's just all too much for white to deal with. So Nepo instead plays knight to h3, retreating the knight, but now Magnus is not merciful. He's actually completely ruthless here. He sacks the rook with rook takes e3. Nepo takes the rook, and Magnus quietly plays this move f4. Knight guards the pawn, threatens the rook on e3, and if you move the rook away with rook e4, now Magnus plays queen takes h3, and the game is effectively over because Magnus has a bishop and a knight in return for the rook here. There's knight e3 lurking as well, and it's just totally hopeless. Nepo continues with knight to f1, but now Magnus plays knight to e3, discovering the rook on e4 here and threatening to mate on g2. Nepo plays knight takes e3, and after bishop takes e4, Magnus, I should say, gets the win here because Nepomniachtchi resigns the game. White is already down a piece. Black has two bishops versus a knight. If white captures the bishop, pawn takes knight, you simply will have a position after queen e2 where black can play bishop e7. Extra bishop on the board for a player of Magnus Carlsen's caliber. Simply too much to overcome. Additionally, if you move the knight away, there's bishop takes f3, and this is just totally hopeless as well. Down a piece, getting mated. Nothing worse could happen against Magnus Carlsen, one of the greatest players to ever play the game of chess. So after bishop takes e4, Nepo resigns this game. He ends up falling behind by 7 games. Magnus would just simply run away with this match. He would win by a score of 20.5 to 9.5, a very brutal 11-point victory for Magnus, showing once again why he is so dangerous and so strong at this great game that we call chess. So all in all, amazing win for Magnus. He moves on to the semifinals where he will play against Wesley. So in the other semifinals, I will be playing against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, who won a very nice matchup against Nihal Sarin from India today. So it's going to be a really exciting hype finish to the Speed Chess Championship. Once again, we'll see if I can make this 6 in a row or if Maxime and or Magnus can stop me. But at any rate, we'll see what happens in the coming days. So make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back with some more great YouTube only content in the very, very near future. See you guys. Bye.